and welcome to the CX Files podcast for Thursday, the 31st of March. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan in Montreal, Quebec. Mark, I cannot believe that we are already at the end of Q1 2022. Where has the time gone?
Yeah, absolutely. I know what you mean. And for me, it feels like I've just been continuously running all this year. It's constant deadlines all over the place. And it's taken a quarter just to catch up with everything.
I know exactly what you're saying. I feel your pain, but you've also been running recently for a very happy and very exciting reason. And I think that everybody listening today will probably be delighted to congratulate you on the arrival of Olivia. So congratulations to you and Renata.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, well, she's sleeping just down the hall from me right now, and hopefully she remains sleeping for the rest of our recording this morning anyway.
That's a good point. It sounds like the construction next door seems to have ceased, so we might be able to replace the banging with a little crying.
Yeah, hopefully. Let's see. We'll go from one problem to another with the podcast recording. Fortunately, there is a podcast studio opposite me where I live. So I've been checking out their prices and stuff, and it seems fairly reasonable. So, if my neighbor starts his renovation work again, or if the baby starts crying every time I'm trying to record, I think at least I do have an option for the future.
Well, we think they were renovations. We're not sure. It could have been something else, but you never know. Anyway, Mark, the CX world is really, I'm finding, in a state of reopening from the perspective of live events. And before we get into our interview this week, I was just going to mention, I have the pleasure of speaking next week at the Pro Progressio Summit. It's being held in Gdansk, Poland. Now, this is one of a number of different events that I have been invited to speak at. It looks like in May, I'll be going down to speak at the Colombian BPO Association's event in Cartagena. But I've been watching LinkedIn. There's been some great photos of a recent event that Execs in the Know held in the United States. We heard recently about a tremendous event that went on in Rwanda to promote Rwanda as a CX destination. I think that the days of live events are coming back, and near as I can tell, the excitement that all CX stakeholders and all BPO stakeholders have to take part and participate in these events is really off the charts.
Yeah, and I was grateful to Elvis and the team there for inviting me to that Rwanda event. But, clearly, it was pretty much exactly when Olivia was due to be born. So I thought, my wife wouldn't exactly want me off on a business trip when that was going to happen. But I can see exactly what you're saying, that we're starting to see the return of the events. And clearly there's a big difference. I think that, when we saw the initial phase of the pandemic and companies switching to a lot of online webinars and other content, initially people were very accepting of it, but it wasn't very long before we all became burnt out from webinars. And also some of the companies were not really very inventive either. I saw some 3-day conferences transferred online, literally using the same agenda. So I don't know who would be sitting in their study watching video for 3 days, so.
No way.
It's just not going to work. So you don't know. We all know that when we attend a conference in person, that's you attend some of the talks, but a lot of it is for the networking and meeting people.
It's the networking, yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of organizations, to be fair, that did hold these large-scale events online at first. The reality is, I think for all of us at the start of March 2020, we were making it up as we went along. And I will not fault anybody for trying something new. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. But the good news is that we seem to be coming out from under, and I'm knocking on wood as I say that vigorously. I'm knocking on my head too. I'm no double entendres there. But there's also some exciting news, Mark. Next week on Thursday, so a week from today, Ryan Strategic Advisory will be announcing the top 5 most favored customer experience offshore delivery locations.
Okay, that was next Thursday, you said then, yeah? So we should actually do a special announcement at the beginning of the next CX Files as well.
Yeah, it's highly possible that we will do that. All I can say is the data has been crunched. We are formulating our report, and when the announcement does come, what I will say is just a highlight or just a bit of a teaser. It will fundamentally, I think, reshape people's views about the direction offshoring is going from a customer experience standpoint. Some big surprises this year, some very, very different results compared to what we would have had in the past. And I think will speak volumes in terms of the direction that outsourcers and their clients are going to look when it comes to different nearshore and offshore destinations.
Okay, so why don't we get into our interview? Now, I know that you talked to Jacqui Turner,
I did.
the CX dancing queen, and she earned that name because of something that happened during the pandemic. So maybe you want to introduce her and how you ended up speaking to her for this interview.
You bet, Mark. Jacqui Turner is one of the most dynamic people that I've had the chance to encounter in our space. Now, she's based in the United Kingdom, and she, over the course of the pandemic, developed a bit of a reputation, not just as being a thought leader in customer experience management, especially around coaching, but certainly I think is one of the funnest people in our space. She started a weekly routine where on Fridays she would find a piece of music, put the music on and perform a dance routine. And she started it as, I think, a way of sort of coping with the frustration and really the annoyance of the pandemic at first, but it caught on. And she's done a whole series of these dances that she's published on LinkedIn. They get tremendous response. Jacqui is full of positive energy. She brings amazing energy to our space. And she's also started recently a weekly poll where she's asking people to send in their top 4 songs based on a particular theme. The most recent one, I think it was last week's, related to different music collaborations. What were people's top 4 music collaborations? And she gets tremendous engagement. So Jacqui is a real rock star, and we were very lucky to have her for a chat on the CX Files to talk about a whole host of different issues. Now, as I mentioned, Jacqui's specialty is coaching. And she brought a lot of perspective to the concept of what coaching means in the CX space. I think for me, one of the big things that she talked about over the course of our 15, 20-minute chat was the fact that coaching can take on a whole series of different forms. You can have formal coaching, you can have informal coaching, but the reality is it's got to be an ongoing process. It's got to be something that motivates people to want to do better, whether it's at the frontline agent level, all the way through to middle or even upper management. And it's got to be part of the broader business culture. If you're not able to impart coaching from a cultural perspective and make sure that what you're looking to try and get people to do and change their behavior sticks, then it just really becomes training. It becomes sticking people in a room, lecturing at them, hope something sinks in and that they perform in a different way, and invariably they won't, and they move on. So she gave a lot of really good tips over the course of our discussion about what CX organizations, whether it's an enterprise or an outsourcer, needs to be thinking about as it looks to try and impart coaching as part of the customer experience process.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that, as I listened to the interview, I took away this focus on the employees and employee well-being, and she's sort of coaching agents to think of themselves as more like the center of the equation. That they're right at the heart of the brand to customer relationship, because clearly, over the last few years, all we hear about is digital transformation and automation and putting chatbots in and creating a barrier between the brand and just actually talking to somebody. And I think that sometimes when we've seen 100% automated systems, like automated payment systems, for example, I think a lot of the time companies are leaving a lot of cash on the table, really, because if you just actually engage with the brand by talking to a person, often you'll end up buying something else just because you realize that either you're buying the wrong thing or you need something else. So it's incredibly valuable for customer support, but also for this idea of just improving the relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And talking about the relationships, something at the beginning of our discussion, Jacqui brought out, and I think again it was very salient, was the fact that over the course of the pandemic, there's a lot of organizations that let their relationships suffer with their end users. Jacqui referenced firms that perhaps shut down their telephone lines or shut down particular channels. When people eventually did get hold of a representative, and complained about the fact that it was so difficult, they were being told, sorry, it's because of the pandemic, sorry, it's because of COVID. And the reality is consumers are understanding, consumers have some patience, but this can't be an ongoing reason to let customer experience suffer. And I think that one of the takeaways I took out of the chat with Jacqui was the direction that companies need to go, no matter what the sector, no matter what the function, in terms of ensuring that there's going to be a robust level of CX in place to deal with all sorts of different types of queries, because the consumer at the end of the day is becoming a lot less patient and a lot more demanding.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone can get away with that anymore. We're over 2 years into this process now. We're coming out on the other side. For brands to still be saying, look, we're having problems with customer service because of the pandemic. I mean, it doesn't wash anymore, not in 2022.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And I'm convinced that everybody is going to enjoy hearing what Jacqui has to say on these and a whole host of topics. Just for reference, Jacqui's company is called Turner Corner Learning Solutions. She can be easily found on LinkedIn. Again, I think that our audience is going to really enjoy what she has to say. So let's go to the interview.
Okay, let's go straight to the interview. And all of Jacqui's contact details are going to be in the show notes as well.
One of the things that the CX Files likes to do is find people that don't just bring an interesting approach and an innovative approach to customer experience management. We also like to interview people who've got a lot of fun and energy and vigor that they can bring to the table. And I think that our guest today is certainly somebody that ticks all those boxes. We're delighted to welcome Jacqui Turner. Jacqui, so nice to have you here.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Peter. It's great to chat to you on this Friday afternoon.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think where you are and where I am, we're both suffering from some severe weather malaise. So being able to talk about all things CX is really exciting. A good point of departure for our pod today, I think, would be to find out a little bit more about you and what you do in regards to the CX industry.
Yes, well, I've been a trainer and coach now for around 26 years of my working career. And I set up my own business, Turner Corner Learning Solutions, 5 years ago. And I help contact centres deliver service excellence. And that may be through training their customer service teams on how to deliver great service, but also working with their team leaders and managers to help and support them to be the best that they can be to support their teams as well, such as coaching skills, for example. But it's really why I chose to help contact centres is because I spent 27 years of my working career prior to setting up my business working in a variety of different contact centres across the UK and across lots of different industries. So it's a working environment that I know very, very well.
Fantastic. That's a great overview. And we got to know each other through our shared connection on LinkedIn. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what you are becoming well known to be an internet star for on the LinkedIn network. And you know what I'm talking about.
I absolutely do, Peter. So if you check me out on LinkedIn, you will see that my headline says Jacqui Turner, Customer Service Dancing Queen. And, that was a title that many people sort of decided I should be calling myself based on the last, I guess, nearly 2 years now of when we first went into lockdown, of trying to cheer myself up because we're all going through different emotions when we all first obviously went into a lockdown situation, but also to help other people with their mindsets as well. And so I decided one day to do a little bit of a dance in my conservatory, to film it, to put it out there in social media, particularly on LinkedIn. And it was going to be a one-off. But 2 years later, I'm still doing it because people just keep requesting more and more, and it's a great way, I guess, to unwind after a busy working week on a Friday afternoon, to do a little bit of a dance, post it on social media. But it's also now developed into the customer service training that I do. So I've filmed several customer service type videos, giving hints and tips on how to deliver great service, but put it to music and dancing, because I'm a great believer, if you're having fun while you're learning, some hints and tips, then I think it sticks. And so, does customer service and dancing go hand in hand? Absolutely.
Absolutely. I agree with you completely. And the energy and positivity you bring to our sector via LinkedIn, I think is just amazing. And I say keep it up. 2 years, it's going to end up being 2 decades, I predict.
Watch this space.
Watch this space, exactly. So talking about watching this space, let's talk about the CX space, Jacqui. What do you think are the areas that have really defined service excellence over the course of the past, literally 2 years since the pandemic started, roughly this time back in 2020? What would you enunciate would be the key hallmarks of CX in that regard?
I think the first thing I would say is much research over the last 12 to 18 months has shown that majority of customers will prefer to pay more for great service. So, it's never been more important really to make sure that as a company, you're doing your utmost to deliver great service to your customers and great experiences. And I think certainly during COVID, what defined those really standout organizations were companies that had a clear vulnerable customer policy in place, made sure that all their customer experience teams understood it, were trained on it, were able to then provide the right support to people through, as I say, the last 2 years during COVID, that were, those vulnerable customers that were perhaps losing their jobs, having financial difficulties, mental health issues, etc. And I think therefore, that was one of the key areas, I think, that for companies to really deliver service excellence had that clear vulnerable customer policy in place in order to be able to, really effectively support those customers. But also as well, I think having, a multi-channel service. I'm familiar with some companies that shut down phone lines, for example. So it made it very difficult for customers to get in contact when they needed to. And therefore, those companies that really stood out had that multi-channel service. They made it as easy as possible for people to choose the channel that they preferred in order to get in touch. But I also think as well, one of the key things I think was those companies that avoided that sort of blanket COVID statement, as customers saw that as an excuse, that we aren't able to deliver, our normal standard of service because of COVID. And I think what really stood out for me were the companies that were proactive and really kept in touch with their customers to be open and honest about any challenges that they were facing, but being proactive in letting customers know what they were doing to help. And I think they were some of the key areas, I think, that really defined great service and great customer experiences certainly during the last 2 years.
And I totally feel the pain as a consumer, not just a CX advisor, but as somebody who would have had interactions, as would many people have had interactions with different businesses. And as you say, find telephone lines are shut down or emails weren't being responded to, web chats were going unanswered. And the excuse was constantly, oh, sorry, we're dealing with COVID. Well, so is everybody. And with any luck, it looks like we're coming to some type of light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm knocking on wood as I say that, because we've heard this story before, but things do look optimistic. What should, in your opinion, CX departments be preparing for as we get into a new normal or a post-COVID environment? What are some of the lessons that they could have learned from the last 2 years that they need to implement going forward?
I guess, to have policies in place should this situation ever happen again. So whatever those challenges were during the last two years, hopefully companies now have put procedures in place to be able to manage should those challenges arise again in the future. But I guess the key things, going back to what I was saying earlier, Peter, is if there are still any companies that still have shut down their web chat or their phone channels, is to really make sure that they are back reopen, and that staff therefore are equipped to deal with a multi-channel service. I think is one of the key things. But also I think some of much of the research that I've seen has shown that there's been an increase in customer satisfaction over the last 12 months in terms of person-to-person contact, whether that's face-to-face or over the phone. But there's been a decline across sort of email and web chat service. So I think companies need to perhaps look at those particular channels. One of the things that really sort of frustrates me sometimes, when particularly sort of web chat, is scripted responses, so you don't feel you're getting a personalized service. And email sometimes can be a little bit like that as well, because a lot of companies have templates that their staff can use. But and that's great, obviously make sure that people can be as productive as possible, but not if that means that they're not then tailoring that response and personalizing that response to the customer. And so I think that they are certainly areas that companies can really and should be really focusing on. But also as well, I think employee well-being is so important. If we want team members to deliver the best level of service, then we can't assume that because we've come through and hopefully now sort of moving more towards the sort of norm, as we call it, that employee well-being isn't as important. We're still going to have a considerable number of people working from home who have been doing so for the last 2 years and may be struggling mentally. There is a move for many people to move to that hybrid working environment, and that's going to suit some, it won't suit others. Some staff may struggle if they're told that they have to be in the office a set sort of couple of days a week, and they don't have a choice over what those days might be. So I think it's making sure that managers are equipped to be able to effectively manage a hybrid working situation as well as the remote working situation. So potentially looking at the management population and making sure that they receive the training to be able to make that transition as smooth as possible for their team members as well. Because if people don't feel that they're being supported in the workplace and feel motivated, then ultimately that affects the customer.
You're bang on with that. And I'm very happy that employee well-being seems to be a topic that's really, I think, front of mind, no matter who I speak to in the CX industry anywhere in the world. Doesn't matter the industry, doesn't matter the business model. It seems that this is becoming much more of an element that we as contact center professionals or CX professionals need to be taking into account. But you've enunciated, I think, some really good points in terms of what the factors are that CX executives need to be thinking about. Speaking bluntly here, Jacqui, how many of them do you actually think are really taking these into consideration strategically, and how much are still making it up as they go along?
I guess that's a difficult question for me to be sort of 100% confident in terms of what's happening. But I think certainly in terms of the companies that I'm working with currently, I would say are definitely sort of making those considerations and priorities. I think particularly towards helping staff make that transition. So I can only speak, as I say, for companies that potentially I have had interaction with and engaged with over the last sort of, I guess, 6 months, and still having interactions with. But it's I guess reassuring for me to know that certainly still does seem a priority for many businesses, particularly the employee well-being, and making that transition, as I say, from home working into a more hybrid situation. So I'm hopeful that is certainly expanded across a variety of industries and companies. But I guess time will tell.
Exactly, time will tell, and it's good to be optimistic. I like the glass half full approach. Jacqui, talk to me a little bit about what you see as the role of coaching in better CX service delivery.
I'm glad you're asking me about coaching, Peter, because it's a passion of mine, and it's frustrating sometimes, I think, to see many studies showing that around 51% of companies have a true coaching culture. At least that, I guess we can look at that glass half full in terms of it's the majority, but we're still looking at least 49% of companies that don't. And, again, studies have shown that you can enhance employee performance by around an average of 17% with regular coaching. And by regular coaching, I don't mean once a month. By regular coaching, I mean it becomes, the norm, daily, weekly, formal, informal coaching, side-by-side coaching in the moment, as well as the sort of weekly, one-to-one performance discussions. And, if any organization is sending their employees onto a training course and expecting a long-term enhancement in skills, then they're going to be, certainly disappointed, because you're sending staff onto a training course to enhance their service delivery skills. And they come back from a training course, they're brimming with excitement, hopefully. That's what I like to think when they've attended mine. And, you see them quickly putting their skills into practice. But what is often the norm is within a week or so, they slip back to bad habits. And that's because our subconscious drives our behavior. And our subconscious is where we create all our habits. So our subconscious is constantly trying to pull us back to what it knows that we've been doing for the last 2 or 3 years. And so regular coaching support by a team leader, by a manager, can really make sure that those skills that, a team member has learned through attending a training course won't just be a quick fix, short-term 3 or 4 day approach. It will be embedded on a long-term basis. And so if we want to ensure that customers are getting the best level of service, then it's not just about training. Absolutely, it's about coaching the teams to raise their self-awareness about where there's opportunities for them to improve as well.
But I love what you're talking about here, because there is a very big difference between training and coaching. You can be standing up at the front of a room lecturing somebody for ages, and that's not going to sink in. But coaching, you're really talking about a shift in behavior and mindset. And I loved what you said about how it's very easy to undertake something for a week if you're somebody who has just perhaps gone through a training session and then fall back into your usual behavior. That's what we did as kids. Your parents tell you, don't do something, don't tease your sibling, don't stay out too late. You're good for a few days, and then, I'll just forget what mom and dad said. That's the normal thing to do. But really shifting that pattern of behavior, it's almost like steering the Titanic in a quick way. You've really got to think long-term ahead and plan to move that steering wheel, plan to move that direction in perhaps a slow but steady fashion. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And something that I talk about in my training is, if you tell people constantly what to do, eventually the barriers come up, the stubbornness kicks in, and I say we all have the internal teenager still in us. And so, if through coaching support, you're encouraging people to identify for themselves what actions will really help and enhance their skills and their service. And they start to develop these really strong decision-making skills. They're also engaged, and they're going to be bought into what the business and what the organization wants them to achieve. But if you keep telling people, this is what I want you to do, eventually, as I say, that internal teenager will sort of rise above, and that's where people then, you don't tend to see, that enhancement, because they then just feel, well, do you know what? You just keep telling me what to do. You're not interested in my thoughts and ideas. So why should I do what you're asking me to do? And so that's why, why I'm particularly passionate about coaching. It's really about empowering people to start thinking for themselves and to come up with solutions that's right for them.
Okay, so final question then, Jacqui. I think we can all agree coaching is definitely the way to go if we're going to improve customer experience over the long term, regardless of the organization. What steps does a CX department need to take in order to impart that culture or to invoke that culture within the framework of its customer experience management structure or organization?
some key things, Peter, that I think that any organisation that's really focused on developing an embedded coaching culture needs to consider. The first thing, I guess, is the business case. So understanding what benefits having a coaching culture will bring to their organisation. So are they looking to increase service excellence, the customer experience? Are they looking to increase employee retention, etc.? So really understanding what the business case is for developing that coaching culture. And it's vital it starts from the top. So the senior managers, the directors in that organisation need to be leading by example. So making sure that they are receiving and delivering regular coaching with their, operations managers and their team leader population. So that, very often, or certainly in my experience, what I've often seen is that team leaders are really focused around coaching, but it's not necessarily then, filtered through to all levels of managers. So I think starting from the top and leading by example from senior managers is really, really important. Developing, I guess, a clear coaching methodology as well is an important step. So considering within the organisation, where are all the opportunities to apply coaching? So one-to-one performance discussions, for example, return to work meetings is another great way to introduce coaching. Team meetings to coach your team rather than just on a one-to-one basis is also another great opportunity to coach. So really being clear within the organisation where those opportunities are, but also making sure that they, I guess, clearly communicates why the business is decided to focus on developing a coaching culture, so that everybody within the organisation understands what coaching is. And understands the benefits that it can bring to them as individuals, to their team, to their colleagues, and ultimately to the organisation. But also, I think that, Peter, one thing I want to sort of say is that in my experience, one of the key reasons why people don't coach, why team leaders, managers find it difficult to coach, is because of time. And therefore, I think it's really important that a company looks at what the existing barriers are within the organisation. What is currently stopping the management population from coaching their teams on a daily and a weekly basis? And then, I guess, putting the fixes in to make sure that those barriers are removed as much as possible. But also, finally, making sure that there is a recognition and reward scheme in place, so that when people are putting the steps in place that they discussed within their coaching sessions with their managers, that they feel motivated to keep doing those positive steps, because they know they're going to get the positive praise and recognition that they ultimately deserve. And so I think it's really important that not only are all my levels of managers trained and regularly trained to enhance and keep their coaching skills up to date, but also having that reward and recognition processes in place as well, so that people do feel recognised for the great work that they're doing.
Fantastic. Well, Jacqui, it has been a pleasure having you on as a guest today. I've learned a lot about coaching that, quite frankly, I didn't know about in the CX context, and truly appreciate the time and the level of detail you've gone into. And I really hope that the lessons that you've imparted today will be taken on board by CX executives from around the world.
Thank you ever so much, Peter. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.